Hello everyone, and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at the final part of Epic History TV's Napoleonic Wars series. And this is the grand finale, the Battle of Waterloo 1815. And without further ado, let's get going.
April 1814. For 10 years, one man has dominated Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Under his military genius, France conquered an empire that spanned the continent. But finally, he has been defeated by a grand coalition of his enemies. Napoleon is forced to abdicate and exiled to the tiny island of Elba, while the Bourbon monarchy is restored to France in the corpulent form of Louis XVIII.
Yes, so the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1814 and the subsequent Treaty of Paris stipulated some conditions for Napoleon's exile. Now, he would be exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy, where he would remain the sovereign of this island until his death, whereupon the territory would revert to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, which has been reformed here. The Bourbon dynasty is restored to France in the form of Louis XVIII. Now, Louis XVIII is, of course, the brother of Louis XVI, and he has been in exile ever since the revolution, but has finally been allowed to return to France and restored to power. Now, Napoleon would have a bodyguard of 400 men. He would be allowed to keep the title of emperor, and he would receive a yearly stipend from France of about 2 million francs. Unfortunately for Napoleon, this condition was not upheld, as you might expect. But this is the stage for Napoleon's exile here. And Napoleon proved to be a very active and energetic ruler of Elba. So despite him being demoted from his grand and lofty position as Emperor of the French, he still continued to perform his duties admirably. He introduced a new legal code on Elba. He ordered the construction of several infrastructure projects, and he restructured the island's defenses. So he was not at all neglecting his duties as the sovereign of Elba, but still, it's quite a step down compared to being Emperor of the French, of course.
But rumors soon reached Napoleon that France would welcome his return. The French people have little love for the monarchy or its hangers-on, the very people whose excesses led to the French Revolution 25 years before.
Yes, that's correct. Even though there had been quite a royalist mood in the aftermath of Napoleon's immediate defeat, the mood quickly soured, and people started to remember why they had deposed the monarchy to begin with. So popular opinion was turning against the Bourbon dynasty once again, although it was not quite as hostile as it was during the revolution, of course. But that is a gap Napoleon will exploit.
He also learns that at the Congress of Vienna, his enemies are locked in bitter dispute over the future of Europe.
Yes, so the Congress of Vienna is the peace negotiations that are being conducted to settle the future of Europe. And at this time, the Congress is in quite a bitter dispute over the future of Poland, especially, but also the future of the Kingdom of Saxony. Prussia wants to swallow the Kingdom of Saxony whole as a reward, and Russia rather, would want to annex the entirety of Poland. This is not something France, Britain, and Austria could accept, of course. And there was quite a bitter dispute, as I just said. And at one point, there seemed like there would be war between the members of the Congress. But eventually they resolved this issue, but it was very close at some point.
Napoleon decides to act.
Yes, of course, whenever Napoleon senses a split in the coalition, he's always tried to break them apart with, well, modest success, shall we say. But regardless, this is an opportunity that won't come again, and he can use it.
After just 10 months in exile, he returns to France, where the troops sent to arrest him rally to his cause instead.
Yeah, so Elba was supposed to be under 24/7 surveillance, and there were supposed to be British patrols at all times, but Napoleon managed to find a gap, and he used this to escape with about 1,000 men, maybe. It was his bodyguard and a few others, basically. That's all he had when he came to France. Of course, the king soon learned about this, Louis XVIII, and he sent various regiments and troops to arrest Napoleon and bring him to justice, including Napoleon's former marshal, Marshal Ney. And he famously told Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. But when he met Napoleon again, he was convinced to cast in his lot with the emperor once again. Napoleon appealed to him as the hero of Borodino and all that, and he turned on his usual Napoleonic charm to get his way. But due to this fact, his rank swelled and his march on Paris continued. And it's quite interesting to see newspaper reporting at this time, because when they first learned that Napoleon was coming back, they were very hostile to Napoleon. They call him the Corsican ogre, and the monster has escaped Elba. That was the headlines. But the closer he got to Paris, the more friendlier the newspaper headlines became, and by the end they referred to him by his full title again. So it's like I said the last time, the people are a fickle thing.
Most of France soon follows suit. But
now, it should be said, there were divisions in France about the return of Napoleon. Not everyone embraced him. It was mainly the troops, and there was, of course, some support in the countryside and in cities, but there was a divided opinion about his return.
Vienna, the coalition immediately put their differences to one side. They declare Napoleon an outlaw and mobilize their forces for war. Napoleon knows he must act boldly before the coalition launches a coordinated invasion of France.
Yes, so the coalition, when they hear about this, they immediately put on hold the peace negotiations at Vienna and immediately start mobilizing more troops. Now, the coalition had been anticipating something like this might happen during the negotiations, and so they had kept quite a few troops mobilized at this point. Maybe 800,000 to 1 million men, depending on how you count. They were already ready for this eventuality. Now, Napoleon's situation is precarious, but it's not as bad as it was in 1814. 10 months had given France some time to recover, and so he could perhaps immediately call upon 50,000 men, and he would also start mobilizing. So by the end, he had about 200,000 men available to him. Of course, these were required to guard various fronts where the coalition might invade from. So effectively, he had about 120,000 men, maybe, for the campaign. He also had to devote 20,000 men to fight off a royalist revolt in the Vendée again. The Vendée region is famous for their royalist uprisings. and we'll probably talk about those at some point. But arguably, Napoleon's situation in 1815 is better than it was in 1814.
He counts on winning a quick victory and then negotiating peace from a position of strength.
Yeah, so Napoleon had two options. Either he wait for the coalition to come to him and fight like he did in 1814, a defensive campaign, whereupon he relied on all the advantages of being on the home front rings. And he would also rely on irregular warfare, guerrillas basically, harassing Allied communication lines and supply lines. Or he could strike a decisive blow quickly against one of the coalition armies, and whereupon that shock would both rally the country behind him firmly and make the coalition think twice about invading, maybe even offer peace. Because at this point, Napoleon needed a victory. That was certain. Regardless of which tactic he used, he needed a victory, or strategy rather. Because his position as emperor was not at all solid, and the king had left behind many sympathizers, loyalists, and spies, and these needed to be shaken out of the government, and the only way of doing that was to gain a victory at the battlefield.
He targets the coalition armies within easiest reach: Prince Blucher's Prussian army and the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, both camped in Belgium. Napoleon's force is a match for either coalition army on its own, but he'll be heavily outnumbered if they're able to join forces, so he must keep them apart and defeat each in turn.
Now, defeating enemies in detail is what Napoleon is famous for. It's his trademark strategy, basically. And that's what he'll attempt to do here.
Napoleon's army crosses the frontier near Charleroi.
Yeah, so in the run-up to this campaign, there had been confusion about the positioning of the French troops. At this point, Marshal Soult is the chief of staff to Napoleon, following the fact that Marshal Berthier fled with Louis XVIII. And unfortunately, there were some mess-ups in the orderlies sent to the generals, and as such, the positioning of Napoleon's troops were somewhat off, and the attack began a day later than expected, and that gave the coalition time to coordinate a defense. Now, if it weren't for the fact that this happened, it is very possible that Napoleon could have driven a wedge between Blucher and Wellington at Charleroi and defeat them each in detail. And as we saw, his army is a match for either force. And one thing should also be mentioned here that is to his advantage is the fact that Napoleon's army here during the Waterloo campaign consists almost exclusively of veterans of various campaigns. He used very few, if any, conscripts in this army, which was quite unusual considering how he has been fighting the past 10 years. So that is a great advantage for him.
Intending to drive a wedge between the two coalition armies. The next day, Napoleon sends his left wing under Marshal Ney to take the crossroads at Quatre Bras. There, Ney clashes with Wellington's army, still scrambling into position. The Allied troops fight off a series of French attacks and just manage to hold their ground.
Yeah, At Quatre Bras, Ney had the advantage, and he could have inflicted a much heavier defeat, but he didn't exploit those chances, which is quite unusual for Marshal Ney. He was very aggressive, just like Blücher. And yeah, his performance here is a bit curious. He should have been more aggressive, and he should have, really tried to finish off Wellington here.
The same day, Napoleon attacks Blücher's Prussian army with his main force near the village of Ligny. The battle is a brutal slugging match, but the French emerge triumphant. The 72-year-old Blücher leads a cavalry charge in person and has his horse killed under him. He only just escapes capture.
That's such a typical move by Blücher, leading cavalry charges at 72 years old.
The Prussian army retreats, but it is not broken. Napoleon sends his right wing under Marshal Grouchy to keep them on the run, and turns his own attention to Wellington's army. The British general doesn't receive news of Blücher's defeat until the next morning, at which point he orders a retreat through heavy summer showers to a position 8 miles south of Brussels, near the village of Waterloo. There he receives a promise from Blücher that the Prussians will march to his aid the next morning. So Wellington decides to stand and fight. Wellington has chosen his battlefield with care. His troops are behind a gentle ridge which will give them some shelter from French cannon fire. His right flank is anchored on the farmhouse of Hougoumont, his centre on the farm of La Haye-Sainte, and his left on the farm of Papelotte. All three are fortified and garrisoned with elite troops.
Yes, so the battlefield chosen by Wellington here is excellent in every sense of the word. There is a reverse slope which will give them some shelter from French cannon fire, and it will also hide the positioning of his troops somewhat, and that will cause problems in the battle. And then he has these strong anchor points across the entire battlefield. Strong anchor points which will allow him to hold up the French advance. Because if these farms are not taken, there is no way Napoleon and his troops can move forward for a real assault on Wellington's main position at behind the reverse slope. So this is an excellent battlefield for Wellington. And it's just like Wellington to choose very advantageous terrain and fight an extremely competent defensive battle.
Wellington's men need every advantage they can get. The opposing armies are roughly equal in size, but his is a ragtag mix of British, Dutch, and German troops, many of whom have never seen combat before.
Yeah, so basically the only veterans here are the British troops, mainly from the Peninsular War. The rest of the experienced British troops have been sent to fight in the War of 1812 against America. And then we have the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which was just reformed. And there was some experienced men in the armies from the Kingdom of Hanover and the Duchy of Brunswick, but the large majority of these other troops were very inexperienced. And like I said, Napoleon's army is full of veterans at this point.
They will have to hold off Napoleon's army of veterans until Prussian reinforcements arrive, or the battle and probably the war will be lost.
The battle will be lost, but the war, I don't think so. The whole 100 Days campaign, as this is called, is an act of delusion by Napoleon. It has to be said. Even if Napoleon wins at Waterloo, I don't think he's going to get a favorable peace offer, because the coalition knows they have the time and numbers on their side. They have the resources to make this happen. And there's no way. There's no way they're offering him peace, even if he defeats Blucher and Wellington here at Waterloo. So he would need to win 10 Waterloos, and then maybe we can get to a point where they'd have to offer him a peace treaty. But that's not happening after one Waterloo.
Sunday dawns bright and fair. Napoleon has ordered Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians and keep them busy, while he defeats Wellington's army at Waterloo and opens the road to Brussels. But it's Grouchy who gets pinned down, fighting the Prussian rearguard at Wavre.
Now, this is actually according to his orders sent by Napoleon. And later on, they will actually hear the French right wing here under Marshal Grouchy. They will hear cannon fire from Waterloo. And General Gerard, one of his subordinates, urges him to march to the sound of the guns. But Grouchy insists on following Napoleon's written orders, and that is to pursue the Russians here at Wavre. And, this is what leads to Grouchy being vilified in the aftermath of Waterloo, and he has been vilified ever since. But that's not entirely fair, because he was following his orders, and Napoleon hated when his marshals deviated from these written orders. He did not allow them to operate autonomously in that sense. And of course, him being stuck fighting the Prussian rearguards will allow the rest of the Prussian army to join Wellington at Waterloo.
The main Prussian force eludes him and is already marching to Wellington's aid. At Waterloo, Napoleon delays his attack, waiting for the ground to dry, which will make movement easier for his troops. But the lost hours will later prove costly. The battle begins around 11 a.m.
Yes, so it has been at this point raining heavily the previous day, and the ground was extremely ill-suited to artillery, and it also made the advance of the infantry more difficult too. But it's mainly due to the fact that the thick mud that has been created by the rain will not allow him to bring up his cannons. And if you know anything about Napoleon, you know that he was an artillery expert. He always incorporated artillery as a important part of every battlefield tactic he ever employed. And so it was very important for him to be able to bring up cannon. And therefore he decided to wait a few hours to allow the ground to dry up. And this has been discussed ever since. Should he have waited, or should he have started the attack early that morning? Now, in perfect hindsight, we will see that if he had started his attack a few hours earlier, Blucher might not have been in time to save Wellington's army. But this is the decision he made.
When Napoleon orders a feint against Wellington's right flank at Hougoumont, he hopes Wellington will commit his reserves here, drawing them away from the centre, where the main blow will fall. But Hougomont's British and German defenders cling on desperately throughout the day. At one point, the French force their way through the main gate, but it's shut behind them, and the intruders are all killed. Wellington later calls it the decisive moment of the battle.
He's not entirely wrong. The farmhouse at Huguenot was extremely important, and had it fallen early in the day, it would have allowed Napoleon to really move forward with his infantry and artillery and blast Wellington's army. But alas, it was not to be, and it was quite a stubborn defense, one must admit that. and they held it throughout the day, if I am not misremembering.
Around noon, 80 French cannon opened fire against the main Allied line. Most of Wellington's men are out of sight on the reverse slope, but many cannonballs still find their mark, smashing bloody holes in the Allied ranks.
Yeah, so here Napoleon had assembled a grand battery of 80 guns, and even though they couldn't see most of Wellington's troops, regardless, the French gunners were able to hit quite a few of their cannonballs, and Wellington suffered quite a few casualties during this bombardment.
At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon sends in his infantry.
It should be said here too that Napoleon left much of the tactical handling of the battle to Marshal Ney, which will prove a great mistake. Now, why he did that is not entirely clear to me, but it is known that Napoleon suffered greatly from hemorrhoids, which meant he couldn't sit on his horse for very long. As such, he couldn't survey the battlefield. And it is also said that he had an ill stomach, and we know that Napoleon would get stomach cancer later. There might have been some early symptoms here that, prevented him from being active on tactically on the battlefield as he usually was. And so Marshal Ney was left in command. And Marshal Ney, while brilliant in commanding 10,000 men, is otherwise an idiot, as stated by Napoleon. And he often has this habit of throwing himself personally into the attacks, and thereby losing control of the rest of the battlefield, and that is sort of what will happen here.
The French columns are met by disciplined musket fire, and then charged by British heavy cavalry.
Yeah, so at the Battle of Waterloo, it is Napoleon who has the greater advantage in cavalry, and he has quite a lot of heavy cavalry too. In contrast, Wellington is pretty short on cavalry, and especially so heavy cavalry. So this makes this charge all the more important that it succeeds, because if it does not, Wellington does not have many cavalry reserves left.
The French attack disintegrates as Napoleon's men try to save themselves from the crushing hooves and flashing sabres. Scores of Frenchmen are ridden down, and 2 of their famous Eagle standards are captured. But the British cavalry, exhilarated by success, charge too far. They become scattered, their horses blown.
Yes, this always happens during cavalry charges of this nature. What happened at this particular instance is that the riders didn't hear the recall signal, which was relayed by trumpet or bugle or something like that. And they didn't hear the recall signal, and so they continued to charge. And when you charge too far, your horses get tired, and the squadrons get disordered, and which makes them easy pickings for a countercharge.
At their most vulnerable, they're countercharged by French cavalry and suffer terrible losses. Among the dead, Major General Sir William Ponsonby, commander of the Union Brigade. Around 4 p.m., Marshal Ney thinks he sees the Allies begin to retreat and leads a mass cavalry charge to drive.
Yeah, that is not what is happening. What Wellington is doing is pulling back his troops behind the reverse slope. But Ney interprets this as a sign of imminent retreat. And so as to not let them get away scot-free, Ney launches a cavalry charge, unsupported by artillery and infantry, to try to exploit this perceived gap or advantage.
Home the advantage. But Ney is wrong. The Allied infantry are ready, formed in hollow squares with bayonets fixed. The French cavalry can't break into these impregnable formations. They can only circle impotently until they retreat or are shot from the saddle. Ney's failure to support this attack with...
Now, not only was it a mistake to launch this attack without infantry or artillery support, when they had stormed the British position, Ney had the opportunity to spike the British guns, and by spiking them, render them useless. That's what spiking means. And they had the equipment to do so, but they didn't do this. And well, as they said, it was impossible, near impossible, to charge down infantry squares, and so they could only circle them impotently. And it was a while until Ney realized his mistake and ordered a retreat.
With either infantry or artillery is a serious blunder. Meanwhile, Blücher's Prussians have begun to arrive. They capture the village of Plancenoit, threatening Napoleon's flank and forcing him to send reserves to recapture it. Around 6 p.m, French infantry finally capture the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center of the battlefield. It allows the French to bring forward artillery and blast the Allied squares from close range. They can't miss the closely packed formations, and casualties quickly mount. It begins to seem that if Wellington's army doesn't retreat, it will be killed where it stands.
And that is exactly what is happening at this moment. They captured the central position, brought up horse artillery, started blasting at point-blank range, and at least the 30th and 75th regiments, I think those were those. They were blown to pieces, basically. They were not enough men to maintain the square formation even. So that is the great advantage in capturing one of these key flank positions or anchors. And he had infantry brought up and artillery. And now there was the possibility of launching attack on the center.
But the situation for Napoleon is also desperate. The Prussians are arriving in force, and he's running out of men to throw against Wellington's army. So he turns to his ultimate reserve, the elite Imperial Guard, the most feared troops in Europe. At 7:30 p.m, 3,000 of these battle-hardened veterans march past their emperor and across the corpse-strewn battlefield towards the Allied center. Wellington...
Now let's go back a bit here. So see, what's happening here is not according to Napoleon's plan. The Imperial Guard was to march up straight up the center and break Wellington's lines, but Ney, who is leading the attack by the Imperial Guard at this point, is drifting off course towards the center right, and Napoleon can see this happening, but he tries to send a message to Ney to adjust his course, but he's too late, can't arrive in time, and the Imperial Guard will get cut to pieces.
Towards the Allied center. Wellington's redcoats rise to meet them and pour devastating volleys of musket fire into their ranks. When the Allies fix bayonets and prepare to charge, the Imperial Guard wavers and then retreats.
Now, for the longest time, there has been this myth that it was the Old Guard who conducted this last desperate attack and wavered. But that is not the case. It seems that it instead was mostly Middle Guard, people from the Middle Guard that conducted this attack. And it's an important distinction. The Middle Guard was not at all as experienced as the Old Guard was.
Wellington, sensing victory, orders a general advance. About the same time, the Prussians recapture Plancenoit.
Yeah, and when the Imperial Guard, the most elite and feared troops in Europe, starts to retreat, the impact on morale throughout the French army cannot be understated. This is basically triggered the French rout, because if they can't do it, how can they expect victory at all?
News of the Imperial Guard's defeat and rumors of encirclement by the Prussians sweep through the French ranks. Panic breaks out, and the French army flees the battlefield. Only Napoleon's old guard maintained their discipline, mounting a heroic but doomed rearguard action.
Now this is where the saying, the old guard dies but never surrenders, come from. And it's probably an apocryphal statement, but nevertheless it characterizes the nature of the old guard quite well, and they proved it through their actions. And now some of these old guardsmen had been with Napoleon since Italy, and been with Napoleon 15, 20 years maybe, and so at this last hour they mounted this desperate rearguard action. It was doomed to fail, of course, but nevertheless, perhaps the most heroic feat, among the most heroic feats during the Napoleonic Wars.
Napoleon himself is forced to abandon his carriage and barely escapes the pursuing Prussian cavalry. The battle is won. The Duke of Wellington and Prince Blücher meet and congratulate each other outside Napoleon's former headquarters, an inn called La Belle Alliance. Blücher thinks it's the perfect name for their shared victory, but Wellington prefers the more English-sounding Waterloo,
Of course.
where he has his own headquarters. The Battle of Waterloo was, in the words of the Duke of Wellington, a damned near-run thing.
That it was.
It was also one of the bloodiest battles of the age. Around 50,000 men were killed or wounded, 23,000 coalition casualties, 27,000 French. Due to an appalling shortage of medical care, many of the wounded were left lying on the battlefield for several days.
Now, the Battle of Waterloo is the second bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars after Borodino. So that says something about the brutality in this combat. And like they said, medical care during this age was, battlefield medical care was very poor, and it was only towards the end of this century that we began to get proper medical care for troops in combat.
Napoleon was utterly defeated. Unable to raise another army, he surrendered to the British. They transported him to a second exile on the tiny, remote Atlantic island of St. Helena.
This time they really didn't want him coming back, understandably so.
This time there was no escape. He died there 6 years later.
Yeah, and the precautions that the British took this time around were extreme. You should look it up. I don't have all the details in my head, but there were several patrol ships 24/7, 365 days a year. There were more than 1,000 troops close by, and so they really did not want him to get out another time. And Napoleon found himself stuck there, of course, for the remainder of his life until 1821, when he died. During this time, he spent much time writing his legacy, his memoirs, all his thoughts about his campaigns and his marshals, his generals, and yeah, that's really where he forged his legacy beyond the battlefield, so to speak. And he died of stomach cancer 6 years later. And it was quite an ignominious end to his career.
Waterloo marked the beginning of a period of relative peace in Europe. There were no wars between the great powers for 40 years, and the British would not fight on the continent for another 100 years, until the summer of 1914. 40 years after the battle, a pioneer in the new art of photography captured these remarkable images. They're veterans of Napoleon's armies, by then all old men in their 70s and 80s. Among them, Sergeant Tanya of the Imperial Guard.
Amazing that we have these photos so we can see how they were dressed and how they looked wearing uniform. One thing about past uniforms in the past is that they were much more colorful and extravagant than they are today.
Moray of the 2nd Regiment of Hussars, and Verline of the 2nd Guard Lancers. These faces are a tantalizing link to the dramatic events that shaped the course of history 2 centuries ago.
Well said. Alright, that was the end of the Napoleonic War series by Epic History TV. I thank you all who have joined me on this fantastic journey, and we will now leave Napoleon for a bit to focus on other stuff, other historical periods that are interesting, but we will be back to do Napoleon's Marshall series and the Napoleon in Italy series. In the short term, I've got planned some follow-ups to the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna 1815 by Historia Civilis, and the 1848 Revolutions by Epic History TV. And then we'll see what we will do in the future, but rest assured we will be coming back to Napoleon soon enough. But if you have any suggestions for what series or other recommendations I should take a look at, please leave them in the comment. And until I see you guys next time,